Today, justice and judgment. John Marshall versus the Shield. Welcome back to Marvel America, the podcast where history meets heroism. Today, we're tackling law, power, and justice through the lens of two figures who redefine their respective legal landscapes. John Marshall, the longest-serving Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and She-Hulk, Jennifer Walters, the fearless attorney who takes on cases for superheroes, mutants, and everyday underdogs. Both use the power of law to shape society, but their methods were vastly different. Marshall believed in upholding the Constitution at all costs, solidifying federal authority. She-Hulk believes that the law should serve the people, even if that means bending the rules a bit. But when is the law not enough? When does justice demand more than a legal ruling? Can raw power coexist with legal authority? That's what we're here to explore. Let's get into it. John Marshall, the architect of the Supreme Court. He was born in a log cabin back in 1755, raised in the Virginia wilderness. Marshall's family lived modestly. His father, Thomas Marshall, was close friends with, you got it, George Washington, which influenced John's patriotism and leadership style. Marshall was a Revolutionary War veteran. At age 20, he joined the Continental Army, suffering through the brutal winter at Valley Forge, which strengthened his belief in a strong national government. He was a rising legal star. After the war, Marshall studied law and became a highly sought-after attorney. His sharp legal mind caught the attention of President John Adams, who later made him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Before Marshall, the Supreme Court was actually weak, barely respected as a branch of government. Under his leadership, though, the court became the final authority on the Constitution through landmark decisions. There was Marbury versus Madison, 1803. This established judicial review, meaning the Supreme Court could strike down unconstitutional laws. McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. This strengthened federal power, ruling that states could not tax federal institutions. And there's Gibson's versus Ogden, 1824, which defined interstate commerce, increasing the federal government's role in business regulation. Like every hero, John Marshall had his strengths and his flaws. He was a brilliant legal strategist. His rulings still shape American law to this very day. He was known as a visionary leader. He transformed the Supreme Court into a powerful institution. And he was a champion of federal authority, ensuring the national government could govern effectively. Let's take a look at what some people may consider his flaws. For instance, his political bias. His rulings often favored federal power over states' rights, which angered many. He had elitist views. He believed in educated leaders guiding democracy rather than full public participation. He clashed with presidents, especially Andrew Jackson, who famously ignored one of Marshall's rulings. For those of you who have never quite fit in with a school institution, perhaps you can take solace in the fact that John Marshall had limited formal education, but he took the initiative to have a strong self-education. He had little formal schooling, receiving only about a year of formal education. However, his father encouraged self-study, and he devoured classical works and legal texts. This made him a clear and logical thinker, able to break down complex legal principles into practical reasoning, a hallmark of his judicial legacy. I'm having trouble with that word, judicial. When Marshall served in the Continental Army under George Washington, he witnessed firsthand the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. This likely influenced his strong belief in a powerful, cohesive federal government, which became a cornerstone of his judicial philosophy in cases like McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden, which we mentioned at the beginning of the pod. And here's a great argument for seeking out a mentor. John Marshall had legal training under George Wythe. His brief but effective legal training under George, a highly respected legal scholar, reinforced his belief in constitutional interpretation that emphasized national unity and stability. His skeptics, I'm sure, would claim he had flaws. Coming from a relatively modest background, yet rising through merit, Marshall was deeply committed to the Federalist vision of a strong central government. He often ruled in ways that favored national authority over states' rights, which critics saw as undermining democratic self-rule. Marbury versus Madison established judicial review, giving the Supreme Court vast power over elected branches. While a brilliant mind, Marshall was a staunch Federalist, and some of his rulings seemed to align with Federalist interests over the emerging Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. His feud with Thomas Jefferson further illustrated his strong partisan convictions, which at times may have clouded his objectivity. Though he grew up in a rural area, Marshall's judicial philosophy often favored commerce, banking, and industrial development over agrarian interests. This contributed to ongoing tensions between federal and state powers and foreshadowed debates that would later culminate in the Civil War. Let's switch gears, talk about the She-Hulk, Jennifer Walters, the superhuman attorney. A lawyer before a hero, Jennifer was a rising star attorney when she suffered a life-threatening injury. To save her life, her cousin, Bruce Banner, aka the Incredible Hulk, gave her a blood transfusion, which transformed her into She-Hulk. Unlike Bruce, though, she could retain her intelligence in Hulk form, allowing her to practice law while being a superhero. Some of her notable legal battles and superhero moments. We know she was a defender of heroes. She represents superheroes in court, ensuring they have legal protections in a world that often treats them as threats. She fights for the underdog, as we mentioned in the beginning. She-Hulk takes cases no one else will, often challenging corrupt governments, corporations, and even superhero registration laws. And if you're a She-Hulk fan, in the comic books, on the MCU TV show, you'll know she does something that a lot of superheroes, hardly any, I can't think of any off the top of my head, do. She broke the fourth wall. Unlike any other Marvel hero, she knows she's in a comic or TV show and sometimes bends the rules of reality to prove her point. And as a hero, she's got her strengths and her flaws. She's a brilliant legal mind, one of Marvel's sharpest attorneys. She's empathetic and just. She defends those who can't defend themselves. And she's strong and confident. Unlike Bruce Banner, she embraces her Hulk identity. Some say her flaws would be, as a lawyer, she's too emotionally invested. Sometimes she lets personal feelings override legal ethics. She struggles with identity, constantly balancing being a lawyer and a superhero. She's got unconventional methods that I'm sure John Marshall didn't use back in his day. Sometimes she bends the law or even reality itself to achieve justice. When we compare the two, John Marshall and She-Hulk both believed in justice, but their views were radically different. Marshall enforced the law rigidly, shaping America's legal framework. She-Hulk fights for justice, even when it means breaking the law. Who is right? When does law stop serving the people? What do you think? It's time to burst that American bubble once again. What the heck was going on around the rest of the world when John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice? We know that in America, we had the Louisiana Purchase. This is 1803. The U.S. doubled in size. We got that land from France. Thanks, Napoleon. The War of 1812, America's second war against Britain. The Missouri Compromise. This was an attempt to balance free versus slave states. And then there's the Indian Revolt Act of 1830. Marshall ruled against it, but President Jackson ignored the court. Let's go to France. Under Napoleon Bonaparte, France dominated Europe in a series of wars against coalitions led by Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The wars reshaped borders and led to France's invasion of Russia in 1812, which resulted in Napoleon's eventual defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. in 1815. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, redrew the European map and restored monarchies, ushering in a period of relative stability. There was the Haitian Revolution and independence in 1804. Haiti became the first post-colonial nation ruled by former slaves, successfully overthrowing French rule. This deeply influenced the U.S. as it increased fears of slave rebellions and contributed to Napoleon's decision to sell Louisiana to the U.S. in 1803. From 1810 to 1830s, there was the Latin American Wars of Independence. Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South Africa, inspired by the American and French revolutions, fought for independence. Figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led successful campaigns against Spanish rule. The Industrial Revolution was spreading. Britain was leading the way in industrialization with rapid advances in steam power, mechanized factories, and urbanization. The expansion of industry transformed economics across Europe and began spreading to the rest of the world. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, banning the transatlantic slave trade. The British Royal Navy actively enforced the ban, intercepting slave ships along the West African coast. And then there was the Greek War of Independence from 1821 to 1830. Greece fought to break free from Ottoman rule, receiving support from Britain, France, and Russia. The war culminated in Greek independence and influenced other nationalist movements across Europe. The Decembrist Revolt in Russia, 1825. Russian officers attempted to establish a constitutional monarchy after Tsar Alex I's death. The uprising was crushed by Tsar Nicholas I, strengthening autocratic rule in Russia. The First Opium War begins in 1839. Although slightly after Marshall's tenure, tensions between China and Britain over the opium trade were escalating during the 1830s. British merchants were smuggling opium into China, leading to conflicts that erupted into war in 1839. Shaka Zulu's rise in South Africa was from about 1816 to 1828. Shaka Zulu, a military genius, united various Zulu clans and transformed them into a powerful kingdom through military innovations. His reign saw rapid expansion and brutal warfare reshaping South Africa. And this was Charles Darwin's early exploration phase, 1831 to 1836. Darwin embarks on the HMS Beagle, and he visited the Galapagos Islands, and he gathered insights that would later lead to his theory of evolution. How about pop culture in America during John Marshall's era? Washington Irving became the first American writer to gain international fame with stories like Rip Van Winkle in 1819 and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820, stories that still resonate to this day in American literature. James Fenimore Cooper wrote The Last of the Mohicans in 1826. Great movie, too. This helped establish the adventure novels and romanticize the American frontier. Edgar Allan Poe began publishing poetry in the 1820s and early 1830s, setting the foundation for modern horror and detective fiction. We've talked about them before. Theaters and minstrel shows. Theaters were growing in popularity, particularly in cities like New York, Philly, and Boston. Shakespearean plays were frequently performed, often with an American twist. Minstrel shows emerged in the 1830s featuring white performers in blackface imitating African American music and culture, a very problematic but influential form of entertainment at the time. We've talked about the rise of political cartoons and satirical art during this era. Newspapers and pamphlets increasingly used political cartoons to lampoon politicians like Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. King Andrew I, in 1833, a famous cartoon depicting Andrew Jackson as a monarch, reflected the growing role of satire in American culture. Artists like Thomas Cole and Asher Durand painted romanticized landscapes of the American wilderness, emphasizing manifest destiny in the beauty of the untamed frontier. This movement reflected America's growing national pride and fascination with nature. and the birth of American folk music. Folk ballads influenced by English, Scottish, and Irish traditions became widely popular. Yankee Doodle continued to be a patriotic anthem. The banjo, introduced by African American musicians, began influencing American music styles. We had the Steamboat Revolution after Robert Fulton's 1807 invention. This turned river travel into a social and entertainment hub. Steamboats featured gambling, dancing, storytelling, and live music as they traveled the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The penny press in cheap fiction. The penny press emerged in the 1830s, making newspapers affordable for the common man. Cheap, sensational stories called dime novels, although they officially took off in the 1840s, were beginning to appear, featuring wild adventures and romanticized criminals. Public speaking was a major form of entertainment. Orators like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun drew massive crowds for their speeches. Religious revivalist preachers during the Second Great Awakening also captivated audiences with fiery sermons. This religious revival movement, from the early 1800s to 30s, spread evangelical Christianity and emphasized personal salvation, abolition, and social reform. Camp meetings, where thousands gathered to listen to charismatic preachers, became cultural spectacles. We had early signs of baseball and horse racing. While baseball was not yet formalized, town ball and rounders, early forms of the sport, were played across the U.S. Horse racing was one of the biggest spectator sports, particularly in the South. Trivia time. I'm going to give you 10 questions, and I'll briefly pause to let you think about it for a moment. And then when we're done, I'm going to go back and read the 10 questions again to see how you did. Let's get into it. What landmark case established judicial review? What is She-Hulk's real name? How long did John Marshall serve as Chief Justice? How did She-Hulk get her powers? What war did Marshall fight in? What profession does She-Hulk have outside of being a hero? Which president ignored Marshall's rulings? Who created She-Hulk? What was Marshall's stance on states' rights? What unique trait does She-Hulk have that most Marvel heroes don't? How'd you do? Time to find out. What landmark case established judicial review? That was Marbury versus Madison. What is She-Hulk's real name? Jennifer Walters. How long did John Marshall serve as Chief Justice? 34 years, from 1801 to 1835. How did She-Hulk get her powers? A blood transfusion from her cousin Bruce Banner, the Hulk. What war did Marshall fight in? The boy fought in the American Revolution. What profession does She-Hulk have outside of being a hero? She's a lawyer. You better have gotten that one. Which president ignored Marshall's rulings? Andrew Jackson. Who created She-Hulk? That was the immortal Stan Lee and John Buscema. 1980. What was Marshall's stance on states' rights? He believed in a strong federal government. What unique trait does She-Hulk have that most Marvel heroes don't? She breaks the fourth wall. You guys ready for your Socratic questions? This first one's a big one, and it's a long one, so stick with me here. It's a very controversial issue in American history. So here we go. Imagine you are the Chief Justice of the United States in 1832. You have just ruled that Native American tribes are sovereign nations and that Georgia has no legal authority to remove the Cherokee from their land. Your ruling upholds past treaties and defends the rights of an entire people. However, President Andrew Jackson openly defies your decision, and Georgia continues its forced removal of the Cherokee. Thousands of men, women, and children will be marched westward on what will become the Trail of Tears. leading to immense suffering and death. You have no army, no power to enforce your ruling, only the Constitution and your own moral authority. Now ask yourself, should you, as a Supreme Court justice, rule based purely on the law, knowing it may not be enforced? Or should you adjust your ruling to something that might actually influence those in power? Or should you go outside the law somehow to prevent the trail of tears from even happening? If you were in John Marshall's position, how would you act? Would you fight for justice even if your voice would be ignored? Or would you compromise to preserve stability? And if you were Jackson, do you believe a president has the right to ignore a Supreme Court ruling if they believe they are acting in the best interest of the nation? All right, here's your second one. This one's not quite as long, but still one that'll make you think. If you're She-Hulk, would you break the law to protect innocent people? For instance, in the She-Hulk comic book, Volume 2, Issue 36-37, She-Hulk's partner, Jacinda, is captured and subjected to brutal experiments by the government. To save her friend, She-Hulk breaks into the facility, defying legal boundaries to rescue Jacinda. Would you break the law like that? Think about it. And there you have it. Both Marshall and She-Hulk remind us that justice isn't always clear-cut. What do you think? Should laws be absolute, or should power shape justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Leave a review, and join us next time for another deep dive into history and heroism. I love you.